Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, editor-in-chief at the Mises Institute. Thank you for joining me today. If you haven't been there lately, be sure and check out our website for podcasts like this, for free books, for daily essays, and more. That's at Mises.org or MISES.org. And while you're at it, go ahead and click on subscribe at the top for weekly or daily updates, your choice. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about one aspect of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, of course, is a huge topic. So we're going to want to talk about a little bit about a counter-revolutionary war within the French Revolutionary Wars. That is called the War in the Vendée, or sometimes just the Vendée. The reason I'm bringing this up is there's a new movie about the Vendée that is recently being made available to American audiences. This movie's called Victory or Death. You can now get it on Blu-ray, watch it streaming, DVD, whatever. And the rights to distribute it in the U.S. have recently been acquired by some conservative groups, and I've seen it also promoted online by a variety of groups. It's also gotten write-ups in mostly the conservative press, and I see it here being promotions are being posted by Archduke Edward Habsburg, for example. Most of the people promoting this book, they're involved in, I would say, social traditionalism of some kind within the conservative movement. So these aren't people necessarily, they're not Republicans or concerned with American foreign policy so much, but they tend to be what your more moral traditionalists. So it's not surprising to see that they're supporting this movie about the Vendée, because over the centuries, since it occurred in the 1790s, the Vendée has been a highly controversial topic that is simultaneously denounced by the left as being some sort of religious fanaticism, or it's been promoted by many elements on the right, mostly outside the U.S., for the fact that those who engaged in counter-revolution against the French Revolution were fighting for, let's say, the independence of the church, for an older aristocracy, for something other than the agenda of the French Revolution, which morphed, of course, into the terror, into quasi-socialism, into downright totalitarianism at times. And it remains something of a political football and a topic that comes up in context of people who read a lot of Western European history, I suppose, right? It's pretty rare that many Americans know anything about the topic, although I do recommend the movie if you wanted just a nice introduction to this topic of the war in the Vendée. And I should note, by the way, that this doesn't appear to be a film that was produced by the same sorts of people who produce a lot of religious and conservative content in the United States. And you may have noticed, right? If you're a critical watcher of movies, and you know a bad movie when you're watching one, you've probably noticed that a lot of American movies that are attempting to fight some conservative angle, say, for example, in the culture war, they're often just not very good. Sometimes they're really good, right? Mel Gibson does that with his movies. He's a competent filmmaker, very good filmmaker, and his movies are often very, very good. But sometimes you'll see a lot of other content. I don't want to name anything specifically, but you know what I'm talking about, right? These movies that you hear that, oh, this covers this great religious or conservative traditionalist topic, and then you watch it and you realize it looks cheap, that the screenplay is corny, things like that. So I was relieved, actually, when I got the Blu-ray for this, when I did watch it, that it wasn't like that. I think maybe that's due to the fact that it was made originally just in French for French audiences. So it has certainly a different flavor. It was made with mainstream French actors, right? No names that Americans would know, but people who have regular acting jobs and resumes in France in television and film, that sort of thing. And also it seems to be produced for reasons of profit, at least to some extent, right? It's not just an ideological project, this film. It seems to have been produced by some companies designed to promote, it seems, a park, which is in the region of the Vendée somewhat, and has some of the themes of this park is like a living history park of sorts, it seems to be. And they thought, hey, let's do a movie about the Vendée, and that'll revive some interest in the region and in this historical topic. And we can make money off of it through this park then if more visitors come. That seems to be some of the motivation. And I guess it started off as a documentary from what I've seen, and then it morphed into a feature film. So it's not a documentary. It's a dramatization of events in the Vendée with actors. So the movie's Victory or Death, in English at least. It's subtitled in English, and it was originally made in 2023, now made available more easily to American audiences in 2026. So now that you know about just kind of the basics of the provenance of the film, what is this topic of the Vendée? Well, I found that the movie actually sticks pretty well to a lot of the agreed upon facts about the event. And so I would say it actually does serve as a fairly good representation of at least what some historians agree are what was going on during the War of the Vendée and what some of the causes were and that sort of thing. But as I noted, this is a hotly debated topic still among many historians, and there's, of course, then just, and among politicians and politicos when topics like the church and conservatism and things like that come up in France. And so, of course, you wouldn't be surprised to see that when the reviews started coming out, much of the mainstream press in France denounced it as reactionary. Still, many stick to the old Marxist terminology for what happened there, and as well as how it should be described, because these terms go back really to the 19th century in terms of how the Vendée was being described by the left at the time. So the basic story of the Vendée, the war in the Vendée, is that it was a war against the Republic. Mostly it was peasants, it was some nobility, and lacked, for the most part, the bourgeoisie. And that's very relevant. So just picture in your mind, we're talking about people in Western France, in a region called the Vendée, very close to Angers today. Some might say that would be included in the region, maybe historically. I don't think it is today. But that part of France, and highly agricultural. And this was a place in the 1790s where the local peasants there allied with some of the local nobility, the small amount of nobility that was still left in the country and still in residency as nobility there, right? A lot of the nobility were not actual residents in the region where they were nobles. They lived in Paris or somewhere else. But there was some nobility that lived in the region and which got roped into then this conflict that was driven largely by the peasants who, when we use the word peasant, just want to make sure that we all know we're not talking about serfs. We're not talking about dirt poor people necessarily. Certainly there were poor peasants in various places. But we're talking about small landowners here, and we're talking about people who have houses and people who have some subsistence. These aren't, right, the bottom of the social ladder necessarily. Maybe a few steps up from the bottom, but they're people who have some means of actually making a living and maybe have some property and that sort of thing. So this war began to coalesce really in early 1793 for the most part, and then it peaked in 1793 as well. There were some conflicts that took place afterward that were inspired, and were some remnants of the conflict. But for the most part, we're talking about 1793 here. And of course, if you know your French Revolution history, you know that 1793 was a time of the terror, was a time of extreme disorder in terms of the takeover of the French state by these bourgeois radicals, the Jacobins, many people getting beheaded, thousands even, tens of thousands really, in some estimates of what the terror led to throughout the country. So this is the time that we're talking about. And the way the movie frames it, which is one of the theories that historians put forward, the movie by no means uses an unusual theory of the origins and nature of the war in the Vendée. It's one of several used by mainstream historians, is that thanks to the curtailment of the rights of the clergy in the region, and also due to conscription, that the region rose up against the Republic. So the movie largely starts out then with a little bit of commentary. There's a voiceover from the main character, a naval officer named Charette, who became essentially the leading military officer in the war. Why didn't they use an army officer, you ask? Well, because most of the nobility, which knew a lot about warfare, land warfare, had been driven out of the country. Some had gone over to the revolution, but many had been driven into exile or had been killed, and so were unavailable. And so you have this naval officer then who becomes involved in the conflict. So this is a real person. In this case, most of the characters, as far as I can tell, were not real people or heavily fictionalized versions of real people in the movie. But nevertheless, let's stick to what they're saying is the source of the conflict. And it starts out with a voiceover by this Charette character talking about how, well, they forced the priests to take oaths of obedience to the new republic. And essentially, if you are familiar with this oath that they had to take, it essentially means that the priest is willing to become a state employee, essentially, because the state took over possession of the physical churches and turned all the priests into servants of the regime who had to take this oath of obedience and an oath to the Constitution. And because of the nature of the Constitution, which tended to be a very highly anti-clericalist and also just anti-Catholic Church, many priests were unwilling to do this. And so what the regime had been doing was arresting the priests who had refused to take the oath and was substituting these obedient priests who were rejected by the local population. This is an aspect that was going on. This is very loosely covered in the movie. They do talk about the quote-unquote good priests, which was essentially the terminology you find in the scholarship. There were the good priests, and then there were the priests that were not good, who had taken the oath of obedience. So many priests fled. The local peasants were left without their parish priests, with whom they had very close relationships. These were integrated very closely into the community. And this was, and we should know that it wasn't just like some vague church thing. These were specifically the parishes, which were important local institutions, and the personnel, that is the priests, who manned these institutions. There was actually much less sympathy for the large land-owning monasteries and such in the region. Those had less interaction with the local peasants and were viewed less favorably in many cases. In fact, there was even sometimes some conflict over land and that sort of thing between the established abbeys and the local population. So in this case, though, they wanted their priests, which would be taken away from them or being forced to take these oaths, which many priests refused. And then the other issue that the movie presents is conscription. And in fact, the movie pretty explicitly states that that conscription was the main issue. And so they talk about how the Republic comes into town, comes into the region, comes into the Vendée. This is all early in the movie. And the voiceover says, the Republic needs cannon fodder, because, of course, the Republican wars throughout Europe are mounting throughout this period. And they had introduced, in substitute for the older corvée, which was some piecemeal and haphazard efforts of required military service that occurred before the revolution. This has been replaced with mass conscription, mass uniform, nationwide conscription of very large numbers. So the Republic comes in, they say, hey, we're going to take many, many conscripts. The locals aren't having it. And the voiceover says, this is the spark that ignites the powder. So the movie is saying that it's conscription that caused the war. There's definitely debate over that, but this is certainly a very plausible and valid theory used by some historians for what really set off the conflict. It then dramatizes a situation where the townspeople, the peasants, come into the local towns. They say, we don't want your freedom, right? This is right. The revolutionary government in the 1790s, much like modern United States, right, goes around, blows up places and people and says, hey, we're giving you the gift of freedom. So the local peasants here are seeing that is happening with the Republic here as well. They'll move in, they'll conquer, they'll burn, they'll destroy, but say, hey, it's all in the name of freedom. That was the MO of the old French Republic in many cases. And then one peasant says, why should I die fighting against enemies I don't even know? Right? So it's establishing this sort of localism, which is certainly recognized as one motivation then within the Vendée at the time. The peasants come in chanting peace, and the representatives from the Republic literally chant war in response. War against our enemies, war against the crowned heads of Europe. Right? We need to establish the Republic and democracy and all that sort of stuff around Europe. So we're going to conscript you. We're going to enslave your local sons, and we're going to ship them off to the front is essentially what's going on in these scenes. And so the local farmers, they say, hey, leave our sons to our fields. And then it shows the conflict, right? This happens as it really did happen in many cases in real life, right? There's a conflict. Some people get shot in many cases. There's some low-level violence. This leads to more ill will. And this leads to then finally the really hardening of sides against this. And then the voiceover concludes its rounding up of what caused the conflict by saying, quote, thousands of angry peasants gather to take up arms and defend what they hold most dear, their sons, their faith, their king. And this establishes then just sort of a theme throughout the movie, which, like many other aspects, is debated, right? How royalist were the peasants in the Vendée? How Catholic were they in abstract, right? It's one thing to be fighting for some theological abstract theory. It's another thing to be fighting for the independence of your local priest, whom you know personally. So the question is, okay, well, how much were they motivated by these religious issues? And then, of course, no one disputes that they were probably fighting then for just local autonomy and the right to not be conscripted. That seems to be a pretty commonly accepted reason for the fight. So the movie then takes you through this period, mostly through 1793. And there's lots of shenanigans on the part of the Republic, as you might guess. But for the most part, I think presents a pretty decent and plausible scenario for what this would have looked like in terms of local peasants fighting back against the regime with the help of some ruling class people who actually understand war and how it works. Now, here we are in 2026, so you can probably guess they lost, that the peasants were unsuccessful in their drive against the central government. But we should note that it was a fairly successful revolt, a fairly successful counter-revolutionary movement. And there were others in the country as well, but the reason that people rarely mention them or talk about them is they weren't nearly as successful, because for quite some time, for this year-long period, and really even somewhat after that, they were able to win some level of independence and some level of self-governance through the taking up of arms in this region. So we're not talking about some minor thing that really was irrelevant to the Republic at the time. It was a real conflict. It presented real problems to the government in Paris at the time. And the rebels did fight with some degree of skill. This isn't just something we're trying to blow up into making it into a big deal when really at the time nobody noticed. That's not the case of what was going on in the Vendée. And we know this, of course, because ever since the Vendée occurred, there have been many, many books written on the topic, mostly in French. So Americans aren't exactly terribly familiar with the topic for that reason. But the reason I knew about it already was because a book on the Vendée was written by Charles Tilly. Now, if you follow Mises.org, you know that I've mentioned Charles Tilly many times because Tilly is a scholar of the history of state formation. So, of course, this is a topic we cover. Where do states come from? How do they get formed? How are they created? How do central governments consolidate state power? That sort of thing. And specifically, I've mentioned Tilly's book, Coercion Capital in European States, more than once, and Tilly as well coined the phrase, the state-made war, and the war-made states. Right, the idea there being that states consolidated their powers and grew and became more robust, influential, violent, because they essentially became institutions designed to make war and to defend themselves against war from other neighboring states that were making war as well. And that war is just really the generating process, the major phenomenon that drove the creation of modern states. That's debated to some extent, but certainly Tilly put forth that idea, and that's been very influential within the field overall of states and state building. Now, his earlier book is called simply The Vendée, and it's from 1964. And I think it may come out of his PhD work, and certainly his early work. Now, in the book, Tilly is trying to address some earlier work on the Vendée and its origins, right? What were the social classes fighting over in the Vendée? Who was pro-revolutionary? Who was anti-revolutionary in the Vendée? And why was the Vendée different from other regions of the country, right? Why weren't there more counter-revolutionary movements throughout other regions? And why were they less successful when there were counter-revolutionary movements, and who was really driving the conflict? And Tilly's trying to push back against earlier, mostly Marxist-influenced narratives that took what I think most Americans probably know as the French Revolution narrative. And that was this idea that there were these people at the top, and then there were the masses that were largely impoverished, and the revolution then toppled this tiny ruling class from the top and established a more egalitarian idea, and you had the middle classes come in and take charge, and it went from there. And this then, even if it was bloody, it established a more even-handed government that was less focused around this tiny elite. And of course, when you have Marxists involved, was an important factor in the revolution. It was the people. The people were rising up. The people were tossing out this corrupt ruling class who owned all the property. Now, Tilly is saying, I don't think that's quite it. And Tilly really forwards this idea that the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, were actually key in promoting the revolution, and that it was conflict against the bourgeoisie, between the bourgeoisie and the peasants in the Vendée, that really drove the conflict. And so we do need to get away then from this idea, because the Tilly's theory has been largely accepted. And in fact, in his book, The Struggle for Liberty, the history of political thought that Ralph Raico did, he notes that he's come around to the idea, he's saying this in 2005, he's come around to the idea that the French Revolution wasn't about some uprising of the lower classes or common people, but really was an effort by the bourgeoisie of the time to seize the wealth and the offices and the prerogatives of the nobility which had them. And the bourgeoisie simply wanted to come in and replace them. The bourgeoisie weren't actually trying to in any way dismantle the French state. They were just simply trying to take control of it and really to set themselves up in a very nice way, similar to what the nobility were perceived as doing at the time. So it was, in some sense, then one group of elites fighting against another group of elites. It was the bourgeois elites against the old Catholic nobility elites, and the bourgeoisie came in and took over. And that narrative has become much more popular now among scholars of the French Revolution, and rightly so, because so much of the old narrative was absolutely dominated by Marxists. And Tilly specifically was presenting a counter theory to who had been his teacher, Barrington Moore Jr. Now, if you've been in political science classes, you're probably familiar with Barrington Moore Jr. And he wrote extensively on the French Revolution, specifically in a very influential book called Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And this came out in the middle 20th century. So by the 60s, Tilly is saying, is this really the correct narrative? And being a Marxist, Barrington Moore took a generally favorable view of the revolution, said, sure, it was violent and bloody, but it was necessary to really topple medievalism, this old property-owning class, and to really bring in democracy. And he creates this whole theory about how different types of revolutions work and what is necessary to reform a state and bring in a new democratic regime, which he viewed as a good thing. And his view was closer to the conventional view, right, of the lower classes toppling a ruling class, as a Marxist would tend to do, although I think he's classified generally as some sort of neo-Marxist. Tilly, who by no means some sort of libertarian, but nevertheless he's coming back and he's saying, yeah, I don't think that's quite accurate. And he really starts to develop in a lot of detail this idea that it was the bourgeoisie, and really totally come up with this idea, but certainly developed it and applied it to the Vendée specifically. And he goes into a lot of detail about, okay, how important was urbanization, looking at what did people do for a living in these regions, how numerous were the bourgeoisie in this region. And what Tilly takes away from this is the fact that, okay, the bourgeoisie were a very small minority in the Vendée at the time, although they did enjoy, because they had supported the revolution, they enjoyed special privileges such as being local civil servants, because virtually all the bourgeoisie were happy to take oaths of loyalty to the Republican state. And so they were in local positions of power. The bourgeoisie had managed to take advantage of the selling off of church lands. So they were selling off a lot of church lands by order of the central regime, and the bourgeoisie were growing in their ownership in the region in this way. They were buying up a lot of land, and in this way came into conflict with the local peasants, and had also indeed even taken over management of some of the lands of the old nobility as well, even if the nobility did formally maintain ownership of many of these lands. So Tilly's point is that, okay, the peasants were coming into a lot of conflict with the bourgeoisie in this region, and the bourgeoisie were not large enough in the Vendée to just simply overwhelm and destroy whatever local opposition there was, because there just weren't enough of them. Another important factor is the fact that the peasants in the Vendée were not dirt poor. This could be contrasted with other parts of the country, and other historians have done this as well, is point out that in some parts of the country, closer to central France and in southern France, the peasants were much poorer in many cases, and dirt poor people just barely scratching by. They don't have the resources and the time and the energy to engage in uprisings. You could compare this to somewhat to the American Revolution, right? The American revolutionaries who decided it was worth their trouble to rise up against the British state. They weren't dirt poor by any means. They were among the best fed people in the world and were doing quite well for themselves compared to global standards. And this was true of many peasants in the Vendée as well. And so like the Americans, they had the resources and in some cases the education. They had something to lose, and they were in a position to rise up somewhat. So that was another factor. And we could compare this to other parts of the country then, where the bourgeoisie were just much more numerous, had much tighter control on the local institutions and such. And so the Vendée, where the bourgeoisie had antagonized the local farmers as well as the local nobility to the point where they were willing to ally against the bourgeoisie, was essentially the major factor there. And that's what made it different as well, was the relative prosperity of the peasantry there as well, and the position that the bourgeois people were in. And in fact, one of these details is covered a little bit in the movie, because when they start calling out names for conscription, the first name they call out, it's noted that, oh, actually, that guy's not going to have to go fight in the war because he's a local civil servant. This was a real thing. This actually happened. The bourgeoisie gave themselves local official positions, and they were in the so-called National Guard, which was like the local order-keeping group, similar to the United States National Guard in many eras, where they didn't fight out on the frontiers, out on the borders against the neighboring states. They kept the peace within. And so what that meant then is that if your name was called for conscription in this period and place, if you could show that you were actually some sort of local civil servant and official, you were exempt. And if you were part of the local National Guard, you were exempt. And lo and behold, most of those positions were going to the bourgeoisie. So you actually had situations like occurred in the movie where you saw that the members of the bourgeoisie weren't having to go fight the worst parts of the war, and in many cases weren't having to serve within the military at all because they had some cushy local civil servant job. And it was then just the peasant farmers who were being rounded up and shipped off to fight. So you can imagine what sort of conflict this generates for everybody. The movie also dramatizes some of the more horrific parts of the revolution. They do talk about the so-called infernal columns, the historical name for these groups of Republican soldiers who came to the region under General Louis-Marie Turreau. And they raped and burned and destroyed the region, killed tens and thousands of locals in the region, some estimates ranging from 20,000 to 30,000, which is an enormous number for an agrarian part of the country at the time, noting that many people suspected of being excessively Catholic, excessively royalist, were drowned in the local rivers. The River Loire, I think, being called the national bathtub because they drowned so many people in it as retribution for suspected opposition against the Republican cause. And so this is all mentioned in the movie, dramatized to some extent, not in excruciating detail, fortunately, but it's made pretty clear that, right, the Republican troops were by no means a humanitarian army of people who were trying to spread goodwill or simply bring peace to the region. And this is why in some cases the war in the Vendée has been called a war of genocide even. I don't think you could claim really that some specific ethnic group was being destroyed, but certainly it's the sort of thing where the regime would have been perfectly happy if all of these people had simply disappeared, had died, had fled, gone into exile forever, and the whole region had been depopulated and then taken over by people who were loyal to the regime. It was that sort of conflict. And so what are we to make of the war in the Vendée today? I think it's certainly worth remembering, and this is why I think the movie serves a good purpose, is that I think they emphasize quite a bit that the war was simply really a war of self-determination. This was a war where the locals, they weren't even really trying to found a truly independent kingdom or anything like that. They considered themselves to be French, but they simply wanted regional self-rule. And so in this sense, it was essentially a war of secession. It was similar to the American War in the sense of that they just wanted to be left alone by the central government and to govern their own affairs. This opposition from the Republic is made clear in the film, right? They hate the idea that the Vendéans want to create a state within a state, as they put it. But they weren't opposed to paying some taxes. They weren't opposed to generally leaving foreign affairs to the central regime. They simply didn't want to have all their clergy killed. They didn't want the bourgeoisie moving in and buying up all of the property without any sort of say from the locals in any way. And of course, they didn't like being conscripted. And so this is what a lot of the debate was over between the negotiators on the Vendéan side and the negotiators for the Republic is, can't you just not conscript us, leave us alone? We'll pay taxes, we won't even make trouble. But the anti-clericalism in the central regime by that point, by 1793, had become really quite acute. And of course, much of the rest of the country hated the idea of that, hey, why did these people get off from conscription? And so they moved in. And also, of course, it was all the typical sort of propaganda that you get in the United States, even today, when they talk about the need to govern everything from the center. Right? The Vendéans were rubes, they were hayseeds, they were backward. A common thing that you'll even hear today from the left, and this was used routinely by the Marxists and the opponents of the Vendéans at the time, is that they were religious fanatics. That was a common criticism. Fanaticism, religious fanaticism. This is what you hear a lot. And Tilly, for example, notes that he's skeptical that actually there was much idealism surrounding the religious movement, that a lot of it was just simply, hey, we want to practice our faith in peace. But nevertheless, that term still gets thrown around about what fanatics these people were. They were reactionaries. And so you could get a similar sort of vibe from that as you would get if you had some state within the United States try to break off and say, hey, We just want to practice our religion in peace. We don't want to take orders from the central government. You know what you're going to hear from people in New York and Washington. Oh, they're religious fanatics. They're crazy people. They're really backward. And we have to move in and force them to govern themselves in an enlightened manner. This was essentially what the Republicans were saying in France at the time. We have to control you. We have to teach you a more enlightened way of life. Otherwise, you'll just revert to your backward ways. And so it's just your typical sort of argument that, oh, we can't have any sort of real decentralization. We can't have any sort of local self-rule, because if we allow that, you might govern yourselves in a way that we don't like. And you get this even from people who claim to be libertarians today, right? It's, oh, thank goodness we have the federal government to prevent people from engaging in some sort of unenlightened behavior. Usually they're going to say that unless the federal government enforces you to not be racist, then, right, then we'll have just a totally backward country. So we need the enlightened judges in Washington, D.C. to teach everybody in other places in the country who will either be racist, they'll be too religious, they'll be bigoted against LGBT or something like that, or it will be capitalism run amok. Fortunately, we need the federal regulatory state to prevent people from doing this. And of course, just as in the Vendée, a lot of those are baseless accusations. And the idea, though, is that, hey, you're not allowed to self-govern because then you won't do it right. And I think that's essentially what we're looking at today. And so those people who say that, well, if you govern yourselves, you'll do it wrong, and so the central government needs to step in and do that. It's amazing that some libertarians say that. But those people are on the side of Robespierre, right? They're on the side of the Jacobins. They're on the side of the radicals. They're on the side of the people who wanted to see heads roll for anybody who opposed the Republican agenda of imposing enlightenment from the center. And of course, what enlightenment really meant was the infernal columns. What it really meant was burning down villages, displacing tens of thousands of people, and ruling them with an iron fist. That's what that really meant in practice. But I think the overall general idea, this idea of can we allow people to run their own lives in this place and stick with their traditional way of life? Or do we have to come in and force enlightenment, quote unquote, on them? That conflict that you saw in Republican France over self-determination, over de facto secession, self-rule, that's the same sort of problem we see today in the United States and elsewhere, right? It's a fight for centralization, for imposed values from the center versus allowing people to do things their own way. So I do recommend the film. I do think it's a good introduction to the topic. Yeah, there's some subplots in it. There was a subplot about Louis XVII, the child king, and how he was killed, and how the Vendéans were in some way fighting for him. As far as I can tell, that was purely made up for the film to add some drama. But for the most part, I think it does offer, because it's only about 90 minutes or so, it does offer some nice introduction to these ideas, and to really drive home that these were people fighting for just living their lives and being left alone by a central government. And I think that rings true for a lot of people today. And again, it's a real movie. It's not some cheapo thing thrown together with bad CGI and lots of green screen backgrounds and stuff. It's clearly shot on location. It's an actual production that's been done with real actors and so on. So check it out. You can get it online. Just Google Victory or Death. French movie, right? It should come right up, and you can stream it right away or get it. And they're not paying me to promote the movie, but because Americans know so little about the conflict, I think this is perhaps one of the best ways to get introduced to it. So thank you all out there for joining me for this episode of Radio Rothbard. I'll be back next time with more, so I'll see you then.